So the Muwatta is a collection of hadith, which part of which reflects practices, fiqh rulings, other aspects of which also reflect more so a methodology. So maybe Imam Malik sometimes is bringing hadith and then saying, لَيْسَ عَلَيْهِ الْعَمَلِ بِبَلَدِنَا, we don't really practice according to this. Sometimes he said, I've brought hadith here on purpose to show people that I'm not ignorant of these hadith, I know them. On other times he brings them to demonstrate the ruling. So there's a mixed kind of ingredient to that. One could hope that, if only it was very clear where he's doing what. Sometimes he does elaborate, sometimes he doesn't. You have to remember these are some of the earliest written texts ever on such literature, on such hadith, on hadith or things like that. They are amongst, today it's the oldest really renowned book we have in the entire world to do with hadith. I don't really pay much attention to the Sahifa and stuff like that, but that's in general. So considering that, naturally it would be in a very primordial, very kind of provisional state. So you can't expect it to be highly, super well organized, highlighting everything, if this is one of the first people, amongst the first people to pioneer in this. So that's that. The other thing is, I think you may have a slight misunderstanding, or maybe not, about Amal. I've got a brief clip on YouTube. It may be worth watching that as well. The Amal of Ahl-ul-Madinah is Sunnah. It falls under the category of Sunnah, not of anything else. So some people have mistakenly, because the term ijma' is used by some Malikiya referring to the Amal of Ahl-ul-Madinah as the ijma' of Ahl-ul-Madinah, so some people have mistakenly placed that under the category of ijma'. It's not an ijma', it's never been an ijma', because an ijma' or ba'd is not an ijma' at all. And that would be a weak argument to say the ijma' of Medina outweighs the ijma' of the Ummah. And that's not the wording of Imam Malik. When he justifies it, he says 1,000 from 1,000 are better than 1 from 1. The 1 from 1 ahad transmissions, he says, will snatch the deen from in front of you. And I think that's what's actually happened today. So we have let go of the solid tradition and we've embraced the isolated ahad riwayat, and therefore we have lost the deen in its true pristine sense. And what we've got today is unfortunately a lot of which is a bundle of chaos and confusion. That's because we followed this other methodology of just taking khabru ahad, a bit more of a Shafi'i approach, as the ultimate. But the amal it falls under sunnah, the conclusive sunnah, that was the practice, differentiating between hadith and sunnah, because hadith is a documentation of some guidance or some tradition of the Prophet. It doesn't mean it had to be the practiced documentation, the practiced tradition. It could have been an abandoned tradition. It could have been a misunderstood tradition. It could have been a misrepresented tradition. It could have been an isolated tradition, as Imam Malik said to Abu Yusuf. That he says, amma adhanu yawmin wa layla fala adri, whether this adhan happened one day or one night somewhere, I don't know and I don't really care. But this is the adhan of the Prophet that the children have inherited from the fathers who have inherited directly from the Prophet. So that is an example of the amal. Now, the amal was the lived practice, which is the sunnah, but it is to do with what the Malikiya call al-manqulat al-zahira, the apparent, perceptible, ostensible, the visible kind of actions that were being practiced. Okay, if an element of ijtihad enters it, which it can, does that still remain the amal. This, many ulama would say that remains the amal. They still refer to that as the amal, but they would split this into two tiers. So you have the primary amal, which is the core amal, and you have the extended amal or the secondary amal. Secondary amal is that which rests upon ijtihad. This, according to some of the Iraqiyeen, was a hujjatun shar'iyyah, just as strong as the first primary amal. According to most of the Malikiyah, the secondary amal or the extended amal was the same as khabru ahad. So it's there, it's, mahallu nadhar, it's something min at-tawjihat, it's something that you can take as a point of consideration, you can weigh it up against the odds, you can evaluate it, but it's not qat'i and conclusive the way the amal is. So that's something which is worth noting, and a brief example of this is, let's say, the adhan. Something very clear, very visible. Let's say the Prophet praying audibly in certain prayers. Now that is ostensible, that is perceptible, that is there. Manqulat zahira. The traditions, the practices, the apparent transmissions, so the perceptible transmissions of the Prophet. So now let's say somebody was to say, well, as an example, right, did the Prophet pray when he read aloud, did he used to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim before doing Fatiha? Now the Amal would say he never used to do Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. He would just begin by saying Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Now one could argue ijtihad, the secondary extended layer of Amal, and say, well, did he not do the Bismillah at all? Because or did he do that silently? Because if he did it in his mind, there's no way of knowing that except by actually assessment, your ijtihad. It's not something which is a transmission, it's an omission. So it's something that's been omitted, but was it done silently? So here you'd have to kind of analyze the situation. So this would fall under an ijtihadi element of the amal. But I mean, that could be supported by other evidences. So that's what I'm trying to give an example of. Or if the Prophet never said Ameen loud, did he say it at all? As an example. So when the Imam gets up and says Sami Allahu liman hamida, and then people say Rabbana wa lakal hamd, does the Imam say it? Now we don't hear the Imam audibly saying it. Does that mean he omits it? Does that mean he says it silently? These are all mahallu nadhar. Okay, points of analysis. So you can kind of like analyze them and evaluate the situation. And this, by extension, I'm giving Salah examples because they're very obvious, but you could use any other examples. The amal is not necessarily in so many things, but it is there, and it is a core part of this deen as transmitted by the School of Madinah. Right, so the other thing is a core part of the Sunnah is preserved in fiqh as well. And that's an important point, because it is preserved in hadith, but there's many hadith which are not sunnah. And this distinction was also made by Imam Abu Hanifa, but neglected and rejected by Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal and the other Imams. So, but this was a key insight and wisdom that the senior two Imams were privy to. And I think this was I would argue, perhaps a shortcoming in the perception and understanding of the latter Imams, who took a very, what I feel is a rigid approach, but I mean a very textual approach, but they missed, it's the kind of the trees for the wood kind of thing, for the woods. So my point here is that Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik differentiated. They said not every hadith is a sunnah. And so the question is, so where is the sunnah preserved? It is preserved in hadith, not necessarily in all of them. It is preserved in the amal, but it is also preserved in fiqh. Fiqh was susceptible to a lot less corruption than hadith, because there wasn't as much motivation to corrupt hadith. There was a lot of motivation to, I mean, it was too arduous and difficult and insurmountable of a task to corrupt the Quran. Because when a lot of people were forced into Islam, I say forced, or they entered into Islam detestfully, like they didn't really like Islam, but they entered into it either for political gains or just because everybody around them was becoming Muslim, so there was no point. And this was the early period that is referred to as zindiqs and these kind of munafiqeen, who were truly kuffar, just pretending to be Muslim. And they were many of them were always seeking to harm Islam. And a lot of these were from the Persian Empire, and obviously from the remnants of the Roman Empire too. But a lot of these people were part of, and the Persians, why so? Because they were a lot more organized sometimes with their traditions and their stuff. So in addition with as well, some of the Christians, and so you start to see certain attempts to corrupt Islam. The issue with trying to corrupt the Quran is that the Quran was the core document that all Muslims had endeavored in transmitting and teaching to their children as a primary goal. So it was ubiquitous. It was, you see, everybody was just focusing on the Quran. So it became difficult to say, let's corrupt one surah of the Quran. You corrupt it in Basra, but everybody everywhere else knows it. The second thing is, okay, so one, it was difficult because of the ubiquitous nature of the Quran, the kind of widespread nature of it. Two, if you corrupt, what is the purpose of corrupting something? It is to kind of almost sneak in a virus, to sneak in a belief or something that will end up kind of infecting that corpus and destroying it. Now, to sneak something into the Quran is difficult. Why? Because the Quran comes in, one, it comes in a very rhythmic nature. Two, it has a very select style, so each surah has a very select style to it. Three, the Quran by its nature doesn't delve into certain issues in detail. So for you to try to corrupt it, not only would you have to go against an entire kind of wave of widespread transmission of this book, but you would have to bring such a belief that you could sneak in as a virus, but then you would have to plant it in a surah matching the style of that surah. Now this was it was an insurmountable task. You couldn't really do that. The other thing was that Muslims started to preserve very early, because hadith isn't preserved, like it isn't documented with isnad till at least 110, 120 years after the Prophet, at least. So the first documentation of hadith is probably 90 years after the Prophet under Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, but that's without isnad. So when Imam Zuhri is, Ibn Shihab Zuhri is documenting hadith and Abu Bakr ibn Hazm, there are no asanid. The asanid come after them. So probably within the next decade at the very least, or 2 decades, they come in. By the time Ibn Sirin and all these other scholars have seriously matured in thought and things like that. So fiqh is something that scholars start to document. But corrupting fiqh was another issue, because if you corrupt fiqh, it's not a universal authority. Like if I sneaked in some fatwa by saying Imam Malik said this, people in Kufa wouldn't care. If I said Ibn Abi Layla said this in Kufa, then people in Hijaz wouldn't care, in Mecca or Medina. If I said Layth ibn Sa'ad said this, then people in Sham wouldn't care. And if I said Awza'i said this, then people in Egypt wouldn't care. So because of the lack of universal authority, fiqh, although it was easy to corrupt, but there was a lack of motivation to corrupt it. So that left the ideal and optimum treasure, one could say, to loot and to corrupt. And that was the body of hadith, the corpus of hadith. So this is why people set about rampantly making up hadith because it's the easiest thing you could possibly do. And Muslims make it up. There's many reports of Muslims making it up. There's people making it up for and against the government of the time, the ruling body. There's hadith being made up for rulings. There's hadith being made up for sectarian stuff. There's hadith being made up for virtues of the Quran. There's hadith being made up for people later on. Certain people later on quite openly acknowledge that they made up hadith. There's people saying, when I couldn't find evidences and these are great scholars saying, when I couldn't find evidences to support the madhab of so-and-so, I just made up a hadith. And that's, wow, okay, but that is, so, and you get many people. Ibn Abi Uwais is one of the people said, when I couldn't find it, I just made up a hadith to support Madhab of Ahl-ul-Madinah, for example, which is utterly unacceptable. But still, Nuh ibn Abi Maryam with his, I made up hadith so people will return to the Quran. And these kind of things. And so the point is, and a lot of the Shia would make up hadith, the Sunnis would make up hadith, people would make up hadith for Bani Umayyah, people would make up hadith anti-Bani Umayyah. This is also what I've argued on a separate note, is where the fabrication of all the Messiah concept comes in. One could argue to support the government with the virtues of Sham, but I would also see this as an angle to show that the government or the ruling body would be overthrown, that a Messiah would come and the Messiah would have to succumb to the authority of a person who is from the Ahlul Bayt, because the Ahlul Bayt were the people that were fighting against Bani Umayyah at the time. And the power of Bani Umayyah was in Damascus. And where would Jesus land? He would land there to destroy Damascus, or to conquer, sorry. But these are some interesting points anyway. I've kind of gone on quite a bit here to highlight that. So although much of the Sunnah is preserved in Hadith, my point of saying this is it's also preserved in Fiqh. So it's always worth checking all of these, balancing them out against the three, which is, as the ulama of hadith say, مَا لَمْ يُبَيِّنِ الْمَعْقُولِ وَلَمْ يُخَالِفِ الْمَنْقُولِ وَلَمْ يُنَاقِضِ الْأُصُولِ. As long as it doesn't go against reason, doesn't go against established sources of the Quran or Sunnah that are established, and neither does it uproot a principle of Islam. So that's the kind of universal principles really to test this. So I hope this makes sense. I hope it gives some clarity on saying, well, first of all, what was the Muwatta? Secondly, what was the Amal of Ahl-ul-Madinah, the Manqulat al-Zahira? What about the extended Amal, or the secondary aspect of Amal that kind of that leaned into ijtihadi matters that the Iraqiyin from the Maliki accepted but the others didn't. And then the distinction between Hadith wa Sunnah as acknowledged by the senior Imams of Fiqh like Abu Hanifa and Malik rahimahumullah, and then going into the fact that how was the Quran transmitted. So the Quran, we don't look at the Quran the way we do as Hadith. So Quran was not documented bil isnad, although we have asanid for it, but that's not how it was. It was just ubiquitous. And why the Quran was not an ideal target for corruption, why fiqh had very little motivation for corruption, and hadith became the optimum target because it was it was a soft target. And where we can look today to find the sunnah, we can look in hadith primarily, but we can also look in fiqh as well, which is a unbroken transmission of the tradition and understanding of this deen from generation to generation, right, really technically till our age, one could argue. I hope that's of some help, inshallah.